Around the mid-1900s, heart disease had reached epidemic proportions. Scientists scrambled to identify a cause and offer a solution as hundreds of thousands were dying every year from the disease. Like a deranged killer, heart disease could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time without warning. When cholesterol was identified as playing a role in heart disease, it wasn't long until saturated fat was isolated and then displayed as a causative factor of heart disease as well. Powerful imagery such as saturated fat clogging a sink pipe swayed the fear-filled public, however unscientific it might have been, followed by perhaps the single biggest scandal in nutritional science ever. Low-fat dietary recommendations advising the reduction of saturated fat and cholesterol were hastily disseminated to the American public largely on the basis of animal experiments and epidemiological studies alone. At the time, whether or not a low-fat diet would actually help in lowering incidences of heart disease was far from having been conclusively established. Despite these seemingly intuitive recommendations having been put forth for more than half of a century, heart disease is still the #1 killer of Americans. Regardless of how well-intentioned these recommendations may have been, they simultaneously warped the understanding and the perception of the causes of heart disease for more than 50 years. Simply put, the notion that reducing saturated fat intake will invariably lead to a reduction in the risk for developing heart disease is completely unfounded. Although some may argue that there has been a decline in coronary mortality since the low-fat recommendations have been administered, this strawman argument completely misses the point that heart disease has been the #1 killer of Americans for nearly a century, having first been identified as such in 1921. A recent study examining why mortality rates from heart disease have declined from 1980 to 2000 found that approximately one half of this effect was accounted for factors like improvements in therapy, while the other half of this effect was due to changes in risk factors including reductions in total cholesterol, systolic blood pressure, smoking, and physical inactivity. While the study posits that decreasing total cholesterol plays a significant role in the reduction of coronary mortality, this reduction has most likely stemmed from cholesterol-lowering drugs like statins. This is because even when looking at the most draconian macronutrient versions of that, strong evidence supporting their ability to reduce serum cholesterol is lacking. Regardless of macronutrient distribution, weight loss alone will decrease plasma triglycerides and increase HDL cholesterol. Due to this fact, many studies failed to prove the efficacy of a low-fat versus a low-carb diet in regards to lowering cholesterol because of the inability to control for weight loss. What's more, the effect of lowering total cholesterol and reducing the risk of coronary mortality is most likely exaggerated, as one study found that half of those hospitalized due to a heart attack had normal LDL cholesterol levels less than 100 mg per deciliter, and less than 10% of patients had optimal HDL levels greater than or equal to 60 mg per deciliter, thus encouraging optimal levels of HDL cholesterol through proper diet rather than focusing on reducing total cholesterol through the intervention of drugs, making for a significantly more pronounced effect on lessening the risk for developing and or suffering a heart attack. In essence, the unsupported low-fat dogma, which has been in place for nearly half of a century, has failed to rid heart disease of its near century-long title of #1 killer of Americans. Nor does the evidence suggest that it will reduce serum cholesterol, as is commonly touted, nor does that even really matter in terms of heart health. Furthermore, since saturated fat and cholesterol have been perceived by the public as a causative factor in heart disease, people have generally assumed that simply avoiding saturated fat and cholesterol was a heart-healthy choice. This ultimately led to the S.A.D or standard American diet, which is rich in added sugar, refined carbohydrate, and trans fat. Trans fats were once paraded as a healthy alternative to saturated fats, but have since been recognized to increase blood levels of LDL, bad cholesterol, and decrease HDL, so-called good cholesterol. The increased consumption of trans fats even paralleled the rise in incidences of heart disease, and are now on their way to being banned from the food supply. As pointed out in a recent study examining the effects of sugar and cardiovascular heart disease risk factors, a diet high in sugar has been shown to increase total cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL, and studies show various metabolic risks for cardiovascular heart disease with high sugar diets. In other words, a high sugar diet increases the risk for developing heart disease through causing a state of hormonal imbalance, which will manifest in symptoms such as elevated triglycerides and LDL cholesterol. Thus, low-fat guidelines were not just benign in their role, but serve to indirectly promote heart disease and various other diseases through their negative metabolic effects. Ulterior motives may have played a strong role in influencing this line of thinking. How else could the hypothesis that saturated fat raises the risk for heart disease reign supreme on such little evidence? As the author of The Big Fat Surprise points out, the role of fat in heart disease originally piqued the interest of scientists when it was observed that feeding large amounts of cholesterol to rabbits, horses, and other animals produced heart disease. The study by itself was not the problem, but when people tried to extrapolate results obtained through the study and apply it to humans, there was clearly some non sequitur reasoning. Herbivores in nature do not obtain cholesterol through dietary means, and are therefore not able to efficiently metabolize it, as are humans. In fact, when scientists tried to replicate the results in rats and dogs, they failed. Epidemiological studies also played a large role in validating this diet-heart hypothesis. The hypothesis that the consumption of saturated fat plays a role in heart disease. Ansel Keys, for example, showed a near-perfect correlation in a 6-country study between total fat intake and the prevalence of heart disease. In other words, he showed that the higher your fat intake, the greater your risk for developing heart disease. Although soon after, in another epidemiological study incorporating 22 countries, the association between fat intake and heart disease was significantly less pronounced. Nonetheless, it is important to point out that many variables are at play in the development of heart disease, such as smoking, weight, alcohol consumption, etc., and therefore, no matter how strong the correlation, an epidemiological study can never infer causation. Moreover, at the time of these low-fat recommendations, only a handful of small studies on human metabolism were in place. And as cardiovascular research scientists D. Nicolantonio and more explained, there was an absence of randomized trial data to support the recommendations at the time of their administration to the American public, and nothing has changed since. How then could the American Heart Association, World Health Organization, and the US government come to back the demonization of an essential nutrient, fat, on the basis of such unsound and inconclusive research? More than likely, it was a culmination of pressure to find a cause for the disease that was killing countless Americans every day, the intuitiveness of the hypothesis, and the possibility of ulterior motives. As reported last year by the New York Times, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard scientists to publish a 1967 review of research on sugar, fat, and heart disease. The studies used in the review were handpicked by the Sugar Group, and the article, which was published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine, minimized the link between sugar and heart health and cast aspersions on the role of saturated fat. Whether or not the US government, the American Heart Association, and the World Health Organization had ulterior motives, their backing of these dietary recommendations on such faulty grounds warrants general concern. One of the main oppositions against saturated fat as a whole is that the consumption of saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, and a rise in LDL cholesterol has been associated with a modestly increased risk of developing heart disease. However, many people conveniently leave out the fact that the consumption of saturated fat also raises HDL cholesterol, which is protective against heart disease. Additionally, reducing fat intake in accordance to the low-fat dietary guidelines almost always results in an increase in refined carbohydrate intake, as noted earlier. An increase in refined carbohydrate intake tends to lower HDL cholesterol and increase triglycerides and LDL cholesterol. An increase in triglycerides is associated with an increased prevalence of small, dense LDL particles, which may be another important risk factor for heart disease. Thus, reducing saturated fat in favor of processed low-fat alternatives may only exacerbate the issue of heart disease. LDL cholesterol is only moderately associated with heart disease, whereas a better predictor is the total cholesterol to HDL ratio. As pointed out in a study examining lipoproteins and heart disease risk, in men, 1 unit increase in the total cholesterol to HDL-C ratio is considered to confer a 53% higher cardiovascular disease risk, which means that keeping HDL levels high is very important in preventing heart disease. One of the ways in doing so is by reducing processed food intake and primarily consuming whole and unprocessed real foods while not being afraid of saturated fat. When examining the effects of saturated fat on heart disease, it is beneficial to also observe the effects of saturated fat on diseases strongly associated with heart disease. Diseases such as diabetes and obesity not only significantly increase your risk for heart disease, but are both strongly associated with a condition called insulin resistance, and therefore reducing factors in the diet which promote insulin resistance may also serve to reduce the risk of heart disease. Insulin resistance is a condition in which cells in the body become resistant to insulin signaling, and therefore blood glucose levels remain abnormally high. One way to induce a state of insulin resistance is through the overconsumption of calories. Seeing how fat is the most nutrient-dense macronutrient, providing 9 calories per gram, whereas protein and carbohydrate provide only 4 calories per gram, it would be easy to infer that a higher percentage of calories from fat increases the risk of developing insulin resistance. However, a high percentage of calories from healthy fat sources serves to regulate caloric intake within a normal range in a few ways. First off, a high-fat meal is the most satiating because it takes the most time to digest. And secondly, a high percentage of calories from healthy fat serves to decrease the risk of elevated triglycerides, and therefore it decreases the risk of leptin resistance, a satiety hormone. This is because diets high in healthy fats usually displace refined carbohydrates, which ultimately leads to a significant reduction in serum triglycerides. And elevated serum triglycerides have been found to impair leptin signaling across the blood-brain barrier in mice. Thus, diets high in healthy fats may serve to regulate the appetite through ensuring proper hormonal functioning. In addition, as is pointed out in the book, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, the author states that body fat is carefully regulated, if not exquisitely so. No matter how abundant their food supply, wild animals maintain a stable weight. When animals do put on significant fat, that fat is always there for good reason. When people accumulate excess fat, this tells us that something has gone awry in the careful regulation of their fat tissue. Calorically dense, nutrient-devoid processed foods, on the other hand, are strong purveyors of insulin resistance because of their glycemic index, caloric value, low satiety factor, and hyperpalatability. Consequently, a study examining nutritional factors and the risk for heart disease found that strong negative effects were found for trans fatty acids, foods with a high glycemic index and glycemic load, and Western food. There is insufficient evidence for saturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and total fat. Thus, saturated fat in the diet is not the problem. It is the highly processed and nutrient-devoid foods which serve to promote heart disease and various other diseases. Saturated fat and cholesterol have been wrongly demonized for more than half of a century, and in doing so, nutritional guidelines have inadvertently promoted obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, insulin resistance, and with it a host of other chronic illnesses. No matter how well-intentioned these recommendations may have been, there is no excuse for authoritative organizations to disseminate unsupported dietary recommendations. No matter how intuitive these recommendations may have seemed, there is no excuse to ignore conflicting data. The recklessness and irresponsibility of these organizations have ghastly misrepresented what a healthy diet is, distorted our perception of the causes of heart disease, and have unwittingly promoted disease management over disease prevention.